There's a moment, usually subtle, almost invisible, when a narcissist notices you. Not your appearance, not your smile, not your words, but your presence. Something about your authenticity disturbs the carefully constructed world they live in. Before we dive deeper into Jung's insights, let me leave a gentle reminder. If you care about understanding human behavior on a deeper level, make sure to subscribe. It helps you stay connected to these conversations, and it supports this space we're building together. Now let's begin. Carl Jung believed that human encounters are rarely random. They are psychological collisions that reveal hidden layers of the self. When a narcissist crosses paths with someone emotionally aware, someone grounded, someone who carries inner coherence, something powerful happens. Their shadow, the part they refuse to acknowledge, starts to tremble. A narcissist depends heavily on their false persona, a mask polished to perfection. This mask is their armor, their identity, their survival tool. Underneath it lies a fractured sense of self, fragile and terrified of exposure. Jung described this fragmentation as a result of an ego swollen beyond its natural boundaries, too inflated to integrate its darker, wounded aspects. You, on the other hand, represent the opposite, an integrated self, or at least someone who tries. You feel your emotions, reflect, question, adjust. You don't need to perform to be seen. You exist complete, human, imperfect, but real. And nothing threatens a narcissist more than someone real standing in front of them. That is why empathic people become targets so often. Not because they are weak, but because they are mirrors. Their emotional clarity reveals without effort what the narcissist desperately works to hide. Jung believed that this confrontation activates an unconscious tension. The narcissist senses that their persona is not enough to maintain control around someone who cannot be easily confused or manipulated. When the narcissist first interacts with you, they feel two simultaneous urges: to pull you closer and to disarm you. They want your admiration, your warmth, your attention, but they also fear your insight. You represent what Jung called psychic light, the ability to see beyond appearances, and this light awakens their shadow. Suddenly they feel exposed, vulnerable, threatened, not because you attacked them, but because your emotional honesty destabilizes the fragile foundations of their identity. This is the moment where the psychological dance begins. The narcissist will try to assess you, test you, interpret your boundaries, and understand how easily you can be influenced. Their intuition is not emotional, it's strategic. They observe, calculate, and adapt their persona to match what they believe will make you trust them. But your clarity already creates a crack in their usual pattern, and this crack will lead us directly to the next layer of Jung's interpretation: the mechanisms that drive a narcissist's need for control. If the first meeting with a narcissist awakens their shadow, what comes next is a predictable psychological sequence, one that Jung understood with striking clarity. A narcissist cannot rely on authenticity because authenticity would expose their inner emptiness. Instead, they operate through three primary engines: control, validation, and confusion. These forces shape every interaction, every tone of voice, every calculated gesture. And once you recognize them, you see through the entire performance. The first engine is control. For a narcissist, control is not optional, it is oxygen. Jung observed that an inflated ego is always terrified of collapse, and therefore, it must dominate its surroundings to survive. A narcissist seeks control not because they feel powerful, but because they feel powerless without it. They try to dictate the pace of the conversation, the emotional tone, and even how you perceive yourself. They micromanage reactions, test your boundaries, and subtly impose psychological order. The goal is simple: prevent you from seeing their shadow. Control, however, is never enough on its own. It must be fueled by the second engine: validation. Narcissists crave validation with a kind of spiritual hunger. They don't just want praise, they depend on it. Jung wrote that when the ego becomes detached from the authentic self, it begins to inflate. And an inflated ego must be continuously fed to keep from deflating. This is why narcissists create situations where you feel compelled to soothe them, affirm them, or admire them. Your validation becomes the glue that holds together their fragile identity. But here is the dilemma for them. People who are emotionally grounded, people like you, don't offer unlimited validation. You offer connection, honesty, and sincerity, but not blind worship. And so the narcissist turns to the third engine, the one Jung considered the most dangerous: confusion. Confusion is their psychological fog machine. When control starts to slip and validation becomes inconsistent, they cloud your perception. They twist narratives, contradict themselves, deny what they just said, or shift blame onto you. This creates what many describe as psychological smoke. You begin to question your memory, your sensitivity, even your intuition. And that is exactly what the narcissist wants, because while you're busy doubting yourself, they remain in control. Jung understood this clearly. Confusion prevents you from seeing the shadow they are desperate to hide. It keeps you distracted, emotionally tangled, and easier to shape. But here is the truth they fear most. You have something they cannot manufacture: emotional clarity. Once you understand the three engines, the manipulation loses its power. You begin to see the strategy behind every gesture, every shift in tone, every sudden misunderstanding. And this awareness leads us directly to the next revelation, Jung's most important insight when dealing with narcissists: projection. Because once you see the engines, you're finally ready to understand the deeper mechanism behind them. Once you recognize the three engines of manipulation: control, validation, and confusion, you're finally prepared to understand the deeper mechanism that fuels all of them: projection. Jung considered projection one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in the human psyche. And when it comes to narcissists, it becomes the very foundation of their behavior. Without projection, their entire psychological structure collapses. Projection happens when a person refuses to acknowledge their own flaws, wounds, or insecurities, and instead attributes them to someone else. For most people, projection appears occasionally, often during moments of stress or emotional overload. But for narcissists, projection is not occasional, it is constant. It is their primary method of self-preservation. Jung described this dynamic as an unconscious expulsion of unintegrated material. In simple terms, everything they cannot face inside themselves gets thrown onto you. This is why suddenly and without explanation, you become too sensitive, too demanding, too emotional, too cold, too selfish, or too dramatic. These accusations say nothing about you. They are reflections of the narcissist's internal chaos. You become a living mirror of everything they fear, everything they repress, everything they cannot integrate. Jung believed that people who refuse to confront their own shadows are forced to see those shadows everywhere else. The narcissist doesn't just project to blame you, they project to survive. Without projection, they would be forced to confront the emptiness, shame, and emotional disorganization that lie beneath their persona. Their entire identity depends on keeping these truths out of conscious awareness, and so they push them onto you, again and again, until the line between what is theirs and what is yours becomes blurred. But here is where the dynamic becomes even more revealing. You are chosen for this role not randomly, but precisely because you are perceptive. Empaths, emotionally intelligent individuals, and people with developed self-awareness become targets because they hold projections better. You try to understand, to reason, to empathize, to repair. In the narcissist's mind, this makes you the perfect container for their unresolved shadow. Jung often wrote that what irritates us in others is often a clue to something unresolved within ourselves. But in the case of narcissists, the irritation is not a clue, it is a weapon. They weaponize projection to disorient you, to make you doubt your emotional clarity, and to keep you engaged in a psychological battle you never agreed to fight. The moment you recognize projection for what it is, something profound happens. The narcissist loses power. The force of projection depends entirely on your willingness to accept responsibility for what doesn't belong to you. Once you stop absorbing their emotional debris, the cycle begins to break. You stop reacting. You stop apologizing for things you didn't do. You stop accepting distorted versions of reality. And this shift leads directly to the next, most liberating part of Jung's interpretation. the phrase that breaks the psychological bond, the moment where the projection stops reaching you and the manipulative cycle collapses. By the time you recognize projection for what it is, something inside you begins to shift. You stop internalizing what was never yours, and you begin to see the narcissist's behavior with clarity rather than confusion. This clarity prepares you for the moment Jung considered the true breaking point in any manipulative dynamic, the moment you withdraw psychological participation. And this entire shift can begin with one simple, powerful sentence: "I'm not available for this conversation." At first glance, the phrase seems gentle, even ordinary, but its psychological impact is tremendous. Jung described manipulative relationships, especially those involving narcissists, as a form of participation mystique, a silent psychic entanglement in which the narcissist pulls you into their emotional turbulence. They need you inside the chaos with them. They need your reactions, your explanations, your confusion, your attempts to repair. Your engagement is the oxygen that keeps the cycle alive. This sentence, delivered calmly and without emotional charge, cuts the oxygen. You are no longer agreeing to step into their distortion. You are no longer offering yourself as a container for projection. You are no longer entering the fog of confusion. Instead, you're refusing to participate in the psychological game entirely, without blaming, accusing, or defending yourself. Narcissists rely on emotional hooks. This sentence offers none. "I'm not available for this conversation" closes every door they depend on. It gives no emotional material for them to twist. It denies them the validation they crave. It blocks the attempt to control the narrative. It removes you from the psychological battlefield. Most importantly, it disrupts the unconscious contract that both of you were participating in, the expectation that you will explain yourself, justify yourself, or absorb their projections. Jung believed that psychological boundaries are not loud, they are firm, and this sentence is the embodiment of a firm boundary: clear, simple, non-negotiable. The narcissist expects you to argue, defend, cry, plead, prove your innocence, justify your reactions, or try to restore harmony. Those are the spaces where they thrive. But when you calmly remove yourself, their entire strategy collapses. You are no longer an emotional participant, only an observer, and nothing terrifies a narcissist more than losing control of the emotional climate. This phrase also protects your nervous system. It stops the cycle before it escalates. It pulls you back into emotional neutrality, giving you the inner space that Jung considered necessary for individuation, the return to your authentic self. It is not a phrase of aggression, it is a phrase of liberation. And yet, once you use it, something almost inevitable happens next. The narcissist reacts, not with acceptance, but with escalation. Because when their control slips, their shadow intensifies. This brings us to the next chapter: why they panic, why they attack, and why your boundary triggers the storm they've been holding inside. The moment you say, "I'm not available for this conversation," something fundamental shifts. You step out of the emotional arena, and the narcissist feels the ground beneath them crack. What follows is almost always the same: an escalation, a sudden change in tone, a spike in accusations, or a dramatic surge in emotional pressure. Many people interpret this as proof that they did something wrong, but Jung helps us see the truth behind the reaction. The narcissist is not enraged at you. They are terrified of themselves. When you withdraw your participation, you disrupt what Jung described as homeostatic balance within the narcissistic psyche. Narcissists maintain a fragile psychological temperature. Too much validation inflates their ego to the point of instability. Too little causes it to collapse. Your boundary introduces a state of deflation they cannot tolerate. The ego begins to shrink, and with it comes a wave of panic. This panic activates their shadow, the dark, unintegrated part of the self they spend their entire lives avoiding. Jung believed that the shadow becomes most violent when it is cornered, and this is exactly what happens when your boundary blocks the engines of manipulation. They can no longer project onto you. They can no longer control the emotional tone. They can no longer pull validation from your responses. Cut off from these sources, they are forced to confront their own inner emptiness. To avoid facing this, they attack. The attacks take different forms. Some become defensive, insisting that you are the one abandoning the relationship. Others turn to guilt, disappointment, or moral superiority. Some explode, others cry. Some pretend to be confused. These reactions share one purpose: to pull you back into the psychological contract you just broke. Jung wrote that the ego will do anything, absolutely anything, to protect itself from disintegration. And the narcissistic ego, being inflated and unstable, reacts with even greater desperation. They intensify their shadow, projecting not only what they fear, but what they cannot bear to feel. Anger, shame, worthlessness, and fear spill outward, seeking a target. Because you once accepted that role, they expect you to accept it again. But your boundary remains the key. If you stay firm, calm, grounded, and consistent, the storm begins to weaken. The narcissist's attacks depend entirely on your emotional engagement. Without it, their efforts lose momentum. You are no longer responding, defending, or justifying. You are no longer absorbing their projections. You are no longer stepping into the role that kept the cycle alive. It's the moment Jung would describe as psychological separation. The point where you begin stepping into your true self, rather than being shaped by someone else's unhealed shadow. Still, the journey isn't complete, because once the storm passes, something far more profound begins: the emergence of your autonomy. Your inner clarity begins to grow, and you start to become someone a narcissist can no longer reach. And that transformation is the heart of our final chapter. The form of the narcissist's reaction finally fades. You begin to feel something surprising: space. Emotional space, mental space, inner space. At first it feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because you're no longer navigating someone else's chaos. You are finally standing inside your own psychological territory. And this, Jung would say, is the doorway to individuation, the process of becoming whole, authentic, and inwardly sovereign. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming yourself, separate from projections, free from emotional entanglement, and rooted in your inner truth. When you set a boundary and maintain it, you break the invisible cord that tied you to the narcissist's shadow. You no longer absorb what isn't yours. You no longer shape yourself around someone else's wounds. You no longer participate in the cycle that once drained your energy and distorted your reality. This shift transforms everything. Instead of reacting to the narcissist's expectations, you begin responding to your own inner voice. Instead of being pulled by manipulation, you move according to your own clarity. Instead of trying to maintain peace at your own expense, you create peace from within. Jung believed that individuation requires the courage to face your own shadow, and you have done that. You confronted the guilt, the self-doubt, the confusion, the fear of disappointing others. Or how easily you once absorbed projections that didn't belong to you, and instead of collapsing under that realization, you grew. The narcissist senses this change immediately, not through words, but through the energy you no longer give them. You become psychologically unavailable, not out of coldness, but out of awareness. Their usual hooks no longer catch you. Their manipulative scripts no longer affect you. To provoke guilt, charm, confuse, or shame, but none of it works the way it once did. You have stepped out of the shared unconscious, leaving them alone with the shadow they once placed on you. This newfound inner autonomy creates a protective barrier around you, an invisible shield made not of anger but of clarity. A narcissist cannot penetrate clarity. They cannot manipulate someone who sees beyond the mask. They cannot distort the reality of someone who trusts their own perception. In those terms, you have integrated the parts of yourself that once made you vulnerable, and by doing so, you have become whole. This wholeness is what makes you unreachable. You no longer seek their approval. You no longer fear their disappointment. You no longer internalize their chaos. You walk through life with a steadiness that comes from knowing who you are and who you are not. The phrase that began this transformation, "I'm not available for this conversation," becomes more than a boundary. It becomes a declaration of identity, a quiet, powerful statement that you are no longer part of the psychological game. You have chosen yourself. In the end, this is Jung's greatest lesson. When you know yourself, no narcissist can ever own your mind again.